Hey everybody, how you doing? Been a while since I posted a video on this Ford rebuild I've been working on, so I figured it's time to put something up. Making some progress. I spent some time working on various body panels and some mechanisms. I worked on the window regulators, repaired a couple of gears and posts that had broken off in the regulator mechanism itself. Alright, so I'm working on the driver's side door window regulator. I cleaned them all up. There's 4 of them in this car. And I ran them through the parts washer, cleaned them all up. And the driver's side has a broken gear on it. This is where the handle fits through the door panel. This gear is stripped out on the original one. So I bought a replacement. It's a little bit different than the original, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of fabricating to make it work. So this gear rivets onto the original frame, and I'm going to have to drill a couple of holes and put in a couple of bolts, see if we can get this thing fixed. Alright, there you go. I replaced this little sprocket assembly. And now it works. I might have to upgrade the little tiny bolts that I bolted this on with. It came with rivets, but they weren't quite long enough, and the rivets required the ability to hammer the end into a mushroom. I didn't want to go that far. So I put just 3 little bolts on there, but they're just a steel bolt. I need something that's maybe a little tougher, maybe a grade 8 that won't, you know, come apart. But we'll cross that bridge later. Anyway, I got the regulator working again. I can set those aside and move on to the next project. Worked on the door handles for a while. I decided to change the door handles to 32 Ford handles, which have a key to lock incorporated into them, whereas the 36 didn't. At least the ones I couldn't find had them. Alright, I'm working on the door handles tonight, and what I'm doing is replacing the original 36 door handle with a door handles off of a 32 Ford. The reason I'm doing that is because the handles off the 32 have a option for a key on both sides so that I can lock the doors, whereas the 36 didn't really have a locking option for the driver's side. There's no hole for it, and the locking mechanism doesn't have the parts to make it lock. So there's a few ways that you could fix that. Some folks are using an automatic electric locks with a key fob. You can put in a different style latch, like a bear claw latch, and that would allow you to punch a hole through here and put a key in it. What I elected to do was to kind of research the older handle that had the key option in it and go ahead and just replace the handle part. And for the most part, it fits fine. A little bit of minor tweaking to make it work. Got this one working just fine. It operates all the original mechanism there, and then you have a key that you can actually lock it. And so I'll show you how we did all that on this other side. Alright, so I cleaned up the mechanism, the latch here, in my parts cleaner, then re-greased it. I also replaced one of the rubber bumper stops because it was completely disintegrated. So we'll put this in the door so that I can measure and do some surgery on the handle. So the next thing we have to do is we're going to cut this this handle rod down a bit because it's considerably longer than the stock one for the 36. You can see how it runs through the door quite a bit. So what we're going to do is mark it, and we'll cut it a bit longer than where I mark it, and then we'll add some cutouts for a C-clip. Okay, next I gotta put in some little cutouts on the corners for the ring clip. Alright, smoothed out some of the edges there. That's ready to be popped back in. Alright, so the outside portion of this handle fits the old holes nearly perfectly. It's slightly off, so you have to drill out the holes on here just a size bigger so that the two bolts will hold it. These are temporary. I'm going to get some decorative bolts. I'm going to order some. This just keeps it on. I also replaced the metal bearing, this ring bearing that goes on the end of this with an O-ring, a rubber O-ring, and what that does is it gives some friction on this so that it's not so sloppy. When you put this in, there's a little bit of play right here. I don't know if the 32 had that play. It may not have. But with the metal bearing, it was very sloppy, and if you're hitting bumps, it probably would jiggle. Well, now it has a rubber O-ring that has just enough tension to keep it from bouncing around. The next thing we'll do is put on a snap ring right on the end of this. Right on the end of this post, we're going to grab those notches we made. Got this clip in there. Now the door handle works. Now we have a lock on it. We can lock the door. It's locked. And then I'm going to put the original lock back in there, probably for looks, but we'll see. Also switched gears and started working on the motor and transmission. I put in valve stem seals, bought new rings, honed out the cylinders, measured the cylinders, and they were borderline. They're right up there with being borderline too worn to use, but I didn't want to spend the money to have the block machined. So I just honed out the cylinders and replaced the rings and slapped this motor back together, new seals and all that kind of stuff. And did a little bit of work to the transmission and put the tranny and the motor together. Bought a intake and a carburetor off of a Facebook marketplace because I used the intake and carb that we originally had on another car. The first thing I did was we cleaned up the block, we cleaned up the crank and the pistons, and I'm going to tinker with them a bit. Well, what I did just a few minutes ago was I honed out all the cylinders, just enough to take the glaze off the walls because we're putting on new rings. Decided not to spend the money on having the bores oversized. Next, I'm going to check all these journals here and probably sand on them just a little bit. There's a few scratches here and there on them, nothing terrible, but I can run some sandpaper over it and gloss them up a bit. That's what we're going to work on now. Right, I'm giving a quick cleanup on the lifter bores. They're all fine. They're just a little bit not rusty. They just got a little bit of texture in there because the block has been sitting for 5 years here in the corner of the garage. So we'll just clean them up, take off any rough spots. Alright, switching gears for a few minutes to this head. I'm putting the head back together. Like I mentioned, I didn't want to spend the money to have the valve guides fixed, reamed out, and have sleeves put in. So we're reusing all the hardware. I'm just adding the umbrellas to the top of the valves to try to eliminate the oil that's burning. And it's technically a temporary problem, but it's temporary. It'll last a few years. This car is only going to be driven a little bit during the summertime, so they'll last a while. At some point in the future, maybe we'll rebuild this properly, but I don't want to spend the extra money right now. So what I'm doing is I'm just cleaning up the valves, kind of getting rid of some of the carbon buildup, making sure that the valve seats are all good. And then we'll put the springs on. These are the rubber umbrellas that go over the valve stem, and what it does is snugs up against the valve guide and it keeps oil from dripping down worn valve stems into the combustion chamber. That's what I'm adding now.
Yeah.
First item we're putting in.
Okay. We filming this?
Yeah. You want to grab the end there?
My hands are ready. Hold on.
Let's grab the paper towel. Symbolically.
Okay, symbolically. All right, know what I do right here?
Just grab it right here.
All right, okay, here we go. Woo! Look at that. That's weird.
Okay. So actually what you want to do is
That is weird. Lift it up some. Like that, huh? Wow. There's a yellow tag on it. Does that mean something?
it must.
That yellow thing? Marker or something?
Okay. So ever so slightly.
Yeah?
Okay. Good. Okay. 50.
So you don't have one with a clicker, huh?
No, I just have a gauge on something. Let me do this side.
Should've brought mine, I got one in my drawer. Plays music.
What I'm working on now is pistons. As I mentioned, I honed out the cylinders a little bit just to take the glaze off, and I'm re-ringing the pistons using the same old pistons. I didn't want to change the diameter of these cylinders. We're using the same pistons, but I'm using new rings. So we're gonna put the rings on and put the pistons in tonight. So the way you do this, with pretty much any type of piston, I like to put a little bit of oil on here so I'm not putting them in dry, and also don't want the ends of the rings to scratch up the piston. Start with the oil scrapers in the back, the third ring down. You start with the corrugated, kind of this waffle looking ring. Put that on first because it has indentations that hold the two oil rings. You find your forward, part of the piston that's facing the front of the engine will have a notch in it, and for the center corrugated you want to put the split directly in the back. Don't ask me why, that's just what they were recommending. So once the corrugated ring is in, you put your two oil scrapers front and back. These go on real easy, you don't really have to worry about bending them. Put one end in and just pull it around. I don't really ever use the ring pliers, which probably are helpful. I just roll them in that way. One goes on one side of that corrugated ring, and then one goes on the other side. Okay. And then you want to move these. I should have done it when I was putting them on, but you want to move these around. You want the split on the ring here, the seam. You want the corrugated one in the middle, and then the two oil scrapers on either side of that. They want both of them, all of them facing the back, because the compression rings will be facing forward. So now you have two compression rings, and usually you'll have a button or a dimple on one of them. That's because the profile of the edge is a little different. So the dimpled one, and also it will say on your packaging where they go. The one with the dimple goes down further, the second one down. These are a little more difficult to put in because they're cast metal, cast iron, or at least these are. And if you pull them if you put too much tension on them, they'll just snap them. You put one end in and just slowly bring it around like this. It'll pop in, and then you can pull it up and snap it in. And then the seams of these go on either side of your indentation here. And you get the top ring, doesn't matter which way it goes in. Put one end in, it'll kind of go in a little bit, pull it out, and it snaps around. There you go. So that one's ready to go. Your indentation or your arrow, whatever is going to be on your piston, goes forward towards the front. We're going to set this in here. We're going to turn this around until Okay. All right, we're gonna set that piston just like that, and then we're gonna use a cheap Harbor Freight cylinder compressor here, which works pretty good. If you're doing a lot of these engines, you certainly would want a better tool, but for once in a while it works fine. And all you're trying to do is compress those springs so they will fit inside that cylinder. Okay. Like I say, it's just compressing the rings down, and then you can tap it in. Match up the numbers. 3 on the top, 3 on the cap. That will go together. So you want to take these to 33 foot-pounds, but you want to take it in sections. I get it just snug, back and forth. And then once you get it a little bit snug, you want to start testing. You want to start testing your crank just to make sure it's not binding. And it'll bind if you have the wrong cap on there. You can see it's working fine so far. So we'll take it to 20 pounds. 20 pounds. I'll test it again. Yeah, it's fine. So now we'll go up to 30. 30. And then we're going to about 33, 35 max. There. Now we can test it. Not binding, spinning fine. Perfect. All right, so I'm working on this Edelbrock Carburetor here. I bought this off of Facebook Marketplace along with an intake manifold, small block Chevy. And it's actually in pretty decent shape, except for I noticed that the linkage was sticking a little bit, and it ended up being the accelerator pump. The accelerator pump has a plastic shaft on it, which was rubbing against the frame of the carburetor, and it was sticking. So I use a little bit of sandpaper to smooth out the edges, and we're going to replace it with a new Edelbrock pump, accelerator pump. I'm also going to replace the little needles, these fuel intake stops. The ones that came out were hard and they were sticking, so I replaced those also. I decided not to buy the whole kit and do all the gaskets yet because the kit's like 50 bucks. Didn't know if I wanted to spend that much money yet. So we'll replace just the pump and we'll see how everything works. I got the carburetor rebuilt. Should work fine now. Waiting for a couple of bolt packages to come tomorrow, as well as a distributor, and we'll put the rest of this engine together. But before we can put this engine in that car, I've got to paint the firewall. So I'm going to start working on that tomorrow. Got to do some body work on it and mask it off, and we'll paint the firewall before we put the engine in. All right, we're working on the engine tonight, and I'm replacing the oil pump. The old one was noticeably worn out. You could check the teeth here, and where they mesh, it's very textured. Like it'd run a bunch of junky oil for a while, and maybe some metallic chunks through it, because it's tore up pretty good. And so I decided not to throw the old one back in, especially when these are only about 32 bucks down at the hardware store. So we're fixing to put this on. Has some thought about welding on the screen, if I can find it. Has some thought about welding on the screen. This one was welded onto the old one, but I'm not inclined to do that. They usually are pretty tight once you screw them in like this. I suppose I could tack weld it. Alright, I went ahead and welded the pickup screen to the body. Don't know if that's necessary, but you know, you read that sometimes they vibrate loose, or they lower and hit the bottom of the pan. So we went ahead and just welded it. Took just a second. Next, we're going to put the oil pump on. 65 foot-pounds of torque on the bolt. No gasket needed between the oil pump and the engine. It's got a machined flat surface, and any leakage you would have wouldn't matter anyway. Okay, we're putting on the oil pan tonight, and we're just putting a little bit of sealant on some of the edges, some of the corners where they meet. I leave everything else dry on these cork pan gaskets. Alright, I'm also using reinforcements on these edges. They sell different styles of reinforcing bars, so that when you tighten these, if you tighten them too much, you'll dent the edge of your holes. These kind of help to prevent that. Alright, we got this bolted down. Now I'm just going to torque them to spec. 12 foot-pounds or 144 inch-pounds. So I'm using an inch-pound wrench. And an inch-pound, 1 foot-pound is 12 inch-pounds, so you can do the math on that. Alright, fixing to put the heads on, but first we're gonna clear all the threads by running a tap down them just to clean any debris and rust or whatever out of them. And we have about 12 on each side, it looks like. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 10 or 12. Okay. Okay, you can clearly see the difference it makes when you tap the grit and dirt out of a hole. You can see the threads here versus the threads originally, which are kind of gunked out with whatever. You really don't want that kind of grit and grime in your bolt when you're retightening them down. You want it to be nice and clean. And then we'll put a thin layer of oil on the bolt before we torque them in. Alright, we're fixing to put the heads on tonight. I've got all of the holes tapped out. As you just saw, I cleaned up all the threads. So now what we're going to do is put a little bit of thread sealer, because all these holes go to the water jacket. A little bit of sealer on the threads, a little bit of oil on the head, and put them all in and then torque them down. And you can find the sequence online. You start in the center and you kind of go in concentric circles all the way out. In 3 steps, 25 foot-pounds, 45 foot-pounds, and you end at 65 foot-pounds. Very straightforward. These are iron heads. A little bit different if you have aluminum. So we'll get started by sealing these all up and dropping them in. Alright, as you can see, we set up the valve train tonight. I put the lifters in, push rods, all the rocker arms and everything. We're going to set the valves here. Just a second on adjust them all. And all you're doing on this is you're just tightening all of these down until you can't twist the push rod anymore. Just keep turning it down until it makes enough contact where you can't twist it with your fingers. So the idea is you're tightening all of the rocker arms until you can't spin the push rod. But you want them to be tight, not on the low, but on the flat surface. So you'll do all of them, we'll twist them all and tighten them down, and then we'll rotate the engine probably a quarter turn and do it again. Find the ones that are loose, tighten those down, turn it another quarter turn, tighten any remaining ones that are loose. And once you have them all finger tight, then we'll give them an extra 3/4 turn on all of them, and that will set the preload. That's all there is to it. Okay, I turned it a quarter turn. That means it moves some of these off the lobes. We'll check them again, so you got a loose one there. We'll tighten this bad boy down. Okay. We went over all of them. They're all finger tight. We went around, checked in several spots. So the last thing you do is you tighten these 3/4 of a turn, and that's for your preload. Alright, well, as you can see, the engine's painted. I forgot to hit the record button last night. So all you really missed was that I scrubbed the engine down with some super clean and painted it old Ford blue. Now I'm putting everything back together. So the engine's coming back together. We're going to put the intake on tonight, as well as a couple of other things, water pump and whatnot. And we're going to get ready to put this onto the transmission. Once we get all that together, I can go back to prepping the firewall for paint, and then we'll put this into the car. One step at a time. Okay, we're working on the transmission tonight. I scrubbed it down, degreased it, brushed it, rinsed it off. So now it's nice and clean. It's a Chevy Turbo 350. And what I'm doing is just replacing the filter and gasket. I'm gonna put new oil in it, of course. So I just dropped the pan and took off the old filter. It had some crud in it. So we're gonna put the new filter on, clean up the pan, and put it back together. However, I'm gonna investigate whether I wanna use a rubber gasket or a cork gasket. I'm gonna Google and see what the recommendations are. It's rubber, but it seems kind of thin. I don't know if I've ever used a rubber one before. I usually use cork, but we'll give it a shot, see what happens. Alright, we're replacing the output shaft seal and the input shaft seal, the torque converter seal. Just as a precaution, the transmission's out and on a table, so it's very easy to pop these in and out rather than being under the car. And these seals are about, 10 years old. So even if they didn't get a lot of use, the rubber can dry out and become less pliable. So I just always replace these whenever a transmission is out as a precaution. Alright, a little bit of assembly lube on the inside. This is just in case I forget to lube up the shaft, the drive shaft when I put it in. I don't want to put it in dry. It'll tear that rubber up. Okay. And then I'm going to put a little bit of this aviation sealant on the outside, just a little bit, not too much. Probably not necessary to seal these outsides. I've just gotten in the habit of doing it. It only will leak if you put it in cockeyed and bend it up a little bit. If you put it in straight, it'll be fine. But I've always been in the habit of a little bit of sealant on the outside there. Okay. I like to use the old seal to tap it in so I'm not hitting directly on the new one. Perfect. You can tap on those, but I've dented them before, so I don't like to hammer directly on seals these days. Okay, as you can see, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting this out just with the cold chisel because I only have access to the bottom, not the sides. Anytime you have a seal like this that you can't get at the side, you're gonna have to bust out the seal puller. Super cheap at Harbor Freight. If you don't have one of these, you can always just drill a small hole into the face of that seal, screw in a sheet metal screw, and then use a slide hammer to tap it out. I've done that plenty of times. But we'll use the old seal puller. There you go. This one's kind of mangled, so we're not going to be able to use it to tap the other one in. I'll have to figure something else out here. And this is the seal that runs behind the torque converter, so that if it started to leak for any reason, it's a pain to change. You have to pull the transmission out. So you can seal this one up pretty good. And we have a little piece of pipe here that's gonna tap this in for us. Okay, measured the distance between these mounting surfaces and the edge of this block, and it is less than the distance of the torque converter in this mounting surface. So we know that the torque converter is in all the way. When we put these two together, the torque converter will slide forward and we'll bolt it there. So we are making progress. This next week or two I'm gonna be painting the firewall so that I can install the motor and trans, and the plan is to completely assemble the car before I paint it. I want to assemble everything just to make sure there's no major corrections I have to do to the sheet metal, and we're gonna fire it up and make sure everything's running. And anyway, there you have it. You know, some progress, not a huge amount because, you know, life gets in the way, but we are slowly but surely putting this car back together. See you on the next one.